Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today my guest is Angie Kim. I wanted to welcome you to the podcast, Angie.
Thank you so much, Janet. I'm so excited to be here.
I noticed that you moved as a tween from Seoul, South Korea, over to a suburb in Baltimore. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an only child, and I have some relatives over in the U.S. Who had settled in the Baltimore area. My aunt, who is my mom's closest sister, was an RN at Johns Hopkins. So she had moved over to the U.S. in the 70s. And in 1980, my parents and I followed and through an invitation through the family visa program, moved over to the suburbs of Baltimore. My parents actually ended up running a store in downtown Baltimore. But the neighborhood was so dangerous. It was like one of these corner grocery stores that's, surrounded by thick bulletproof glass, that type of thing. And in fact, at one point, my dad made the mistake of stepping out into the vestibule, and he was actually shot. The bullet grazed his neck. So with it being such, I know, it was horrible. And with it being such a dangerous neighborhood, and with the hours being so long, they really felt like they had to stay at the store just to squeeze in every, minute of sleep that they could. So I, stayed with my relatives, with my aunt and uncle and cousin in the suburbs of Baltimore. And so it was this very bizarre, physical journey, certainly halfway around the world, and, to a new culture and all of that sort of stuff. But even more than that, I think it was sort of an emotional change because I was used to the setting where I was with my parents always. We were really poor, so we all lived in one room in Korea. We had no indoor plumbing, that type of thing. So in a materialistic way, it was like an amazing change in that we came to this house that had multiple bedrooms, and I had my own bedroom for the first time in my life, and
running water.
Yes, exactly. And the indoor toilet thing was huge. So things like that were amazing. But at the same time, I lost my parents in the process, and I never saw them. And so it was this really interesting time in the sense that I got to really appreciate the difference and really think a lot about the difference between sort of what is materialistically, a fortunate thing to happen versus emotionally. And I later became a philosophy major in college, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why,
Thank you for that description of your early time in the U.S. And Korea. So Angie earned a Sterling pedigree, which you just touched upon, built upon dual degrees in the liberal arts. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through the actual process and also how you came to pursue 2 degrees, one in philosophy and one in political science.
So actually even before that, so for high school, I actually pursued the arts. Not writing. I never wanted to be a writer, and that was something very new and recent, something that didn't come to me until my 40s. But when I was a teenager, I very much was into music and theater. So I went to a boarding school called Interlochen Arts Academy, and I had a double major there, too. I was a double major in piano and musical theater. And so that's sort of what I wanted to pursue, and I really wanted to pursue acting, but I was sort of told that, especially with being an of Asian descent, that the opportunities were not great. And also, let's just be honest, I wasn't the most talented, I don't think, in my department. So I think, between all of those...
self-awareness.
Yeah. Between all of those things, it was really, I decided to sort of be practical, and I decided to do the thing that I was actually good at, even though I didn't love it as much, which is, pursue the academics. And so I went to Stanford, and I double majored in poli-sci and philosophy. There was a fabulous political philosophy department that was just starting up when I was there, and so it just seemed like a natural way to sort of combine the two areas, and they didn't have a major in that, so I sort of double majored. And then, especially with your podcast being about sort of change and all the ways that you can change. So in my junior year, very early on, I was an RA, a resident assistant, in an all-freshman dorm. And before we'd had the earthquake training, we had the huge Bay Area earthquake.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so we all sort of freaked out. Our dorm was, sort of it had structural issues, so we were not allowed to return to our dorm for like 2 weeks or something like that.
Wow.
And sort of had to live in the lobby of another dorm. On the day of the earthquake, I had some friends who were actually in San Francisco, and we couldn't reach anyone, so my parents couldn't reach me. I mean, it was just a complete disaster, and I remember just the fear of that, and me from being from the East Coast originally, after my immigration, and I wasn't used to earthquakes, and this was my first big one. It really scared me.
Sure.
And so I decided at that point I had enough credits to graduate early, so I decided to go ahead and graduate as a junior, and then I came over to the East Coast for law school.
I see.
So what's funny is about that whole thing is that when I came to law school on the East Coast, I met my husband, and my husband was a third year when I was a first year. So that means that if I hadn't done that early graduation thing, I probably would never have met him. So it's really interesting to think about how these things happen, and the decisions that you make sort of, and the hinge points of your life, of the important moments of your life, and how, I'm very big into sort of parallel world and multiverse types of theories, and it just really makes me think a lot about that. Like, what if this one thing hadn't happened, and I hadn't been in this one area? Like, if I hadn't been an RA in a freshman dorm with a whole bunch of freshmen who were completely freaked out, would I have maybe handled it better and not decided to graduate early? It's so many things like that.
So now you find yourself in Cambridge, I suppose, for law school? I guess that's a natural extension from your AB degrees. You turned to law.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I knew, I think, that I wanted to be a lawyer, and one of the reasons being sort of that, to me, being a litigator, being in the court room, being a courtroom lawyer, that element of it, to me, seemed very theatrical. You're sort of on a stage. It's funny to call it a performance, what lawyers do, but there is a theatricality to it.
Sure.
And there is a sense that you're performing for, the jury, the judge, and things like that, and drawing out the witnesses. And so to me, that element of being a lawyer had appealed to me, and I think to me that was sort of the second best way of getting to the theater world, which I really loved. So in a weird way, becoming a lawyer was sort of my backup option for, for going into theater. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting that the performance aspect of it, in both on the stage or on the screen and in the courtroom, you're trying to persuade towards truth, right? So trying to make people understand the storyline that is touching upon to expose some truth, I guess.
Yes, hopefully, yes.
But I wanted to ask, since you have an interest in musical theater, so do you have a favorite piece of work from Broadway or...
Yeah, so it's funny. And this is all not to do with the story at all, because the story is just sort of antiquated, I think, and it's sort of not really. Although the whole Russia thing is coming back now, but I love Chess, which was a musical from the sort of 80s, 90s. That was big in those days.
I think they did that within 5 years at Signature Theater.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, this is in the Metro D.C. area.
to me, the music is just, I just loved some of the duets in that. And just for me, it's very personal. Like just the songs are very much in my range. And so I just enjoy singing them.
Good to sing along with.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. So you were the editor of the Harvard Law Review and then moved on to judicial law clerk in Charlottesville.
In Charlottesville,
and then over on to trial lawyer at a large firm.
Being a lawyer was my first career, and being a writer is my fifth. So
Okay.
there's a lot. So then, as a lawyer, I was with a litigation law firm, Williams and Connolly in D.C., and it was an amazing experience, and I loved the firm, and I loved being in the courtroom, but unfortunately, I found that I didn't like any aspect of being a lawyer except being in the courtroom, which is unfortunately like 5% of your regular, day, right? And so your working hours. And so I decided that wasn't really sort of the way to happiness for me. And I decided to leave the law entirely and go into management consulting, which I thought was a great way to sort of segue into a different world. And the firm that I went to, McKinsey, has this great mini MBA program for people who are making career changes from, law or being a doctor or being a PhD or whatever into the business world. So that was an awesome option for me. So I did that for a couple of years, and then some of my colleagues and I, it's a very entrepreneurial place just because you are helping your clients to hopefully be entrepreneurial and to be effective at it. And so we joined forces, and this was during the whole .com era. And so we decided to leave, and we formed a .com. Yeah, we were at a point where we were supposed to, where we were planning for an IPO, and then the market sort of bottomed out, unfortunately. And then we were at a place where we couldn't go forward with that, and then we were going to run out of money. So we were forced to sell our company, and as luck would have it, I was pregnant with my first child at that point. So it was actually it was a horrible time in the sense that I was like 8 months pregnant, and I think I was personally responsible for firing something like 400 employees.
Yeah, wow.
And so it was really just like a very, very stressful time, and the kind of thing that once we were done with it and the sale actually went through, which happened to go through the month that my first son was born. And so it was sort of, it was like a serendipity kind of thing. And I just was so tired, and, having a newborn, it seemed like sort of one of these things where I'm starting a new chapter in my life, and I just needed to take stock of everything. And so I decided to just stay home and not sign on with the new company that had bought my company to, help run it or anything like that, just completely, cut myself off from that world. Whereas my co-founders, who are my friends, who are guys, who, they just went on and sort of, did other things. But instead of doing that, I sort of like stayed home and became a full-time stay-at-home mom. So my son turned 18 this month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So that was 18 years ago. I can't believe it.
Yeah, time flies.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I started writing maybe like 9 years ago, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to currently. So let's see. Angie published your first novel, from what I understand, in April of this year. Been critically acclaimed. It's called Miracle Creek, and it's a literary courtroom drama. Yeah. So I'm wondering how that came about.
So I started writing, about 9 years ago, and that was largely because I have 3 boys, and all 3 of them had some sort of medical issue as babies and toddlers. So they're all fine now, I'm happy to say. So I can now talk about this freely, without worries of medical privacy issues and things like that. But, for a while there, my life was just sort of, going to the hospitals, doing tests, lots of, various medications and therapies and some experimental therapies as well, which is what the foundation of my book is about. So at some point, I sort of got into writing because it was so difficult going through as a stay-at-home mom. And my husband was working, and so I felt sort of alone in this in some ways, and felt like I just had so much that I wanted to sort of say. And so I started writing and just found that, I found a freedom in that's something that I just loved so much. But a lot of the things that I was writing about my kids' medical issues and things like that, I didn't feel free to sort of publish because, of medical privacy issues. Do I really want to write about my kids, who don't have a say in that, who can't really give me permission, right? Because they were so little at that point. And so my husband said, well, why don't you try fiction? And I was like, fiction? I've never written fiction. How could I even start that? So I started taking some classes on writing short stories and tried my hand at that. And it was just amazing. It was almost like I had been searching for this thing through the career journey of all these different careers that I'd gone through, looking for the thing that sort of made me happy on a day-to-day basis and fulfilled sort of, in this more global way, that type of thing. And I just felt like I had finally found it, and I loved it. And I started with short stories, and I submitted them to, these literary magazines, entered them in contests, got tons of rejection letters, but also won some and, got publications as well. And that, I think just that process gave me enough confidence and enough sort of day-to-day joy as well to feel like, okay, I can do this. And so I decided to try my hand at writing a novel. And when I did, it's as if these threads of my life sort of came together. So there was the immigrant thread that I had really been thinking a lot about and writing a lot about. There's the courtroom trial law stuff, which, I hadn't really explored in literary short stories or essays or anything like that. But that was always sort of there in the back of my mind. And then there's this whole medical journey, being the mom of kids with chronic illnesses and doing some of these experimental therapies that I'd done, and the world of special needs parents and parents of chronically ill kids that brought me to. And so those three sort of came together in this idea for a plot idea and the premise for a novel, which became Miracle Creek. And so Miracle Creek is the name of a fictional town in rural Virginia, and it's where the Yu family, which is a Korean immigrant family, resides. And they have something called the Miracle Submarine, which is not a real submarine. It's a medical chamber, a hyperbaric oxygen therapy chamber, or HBOT. And it's an experimental therapy that I actually did in real life with one of my kids. And you go in with a group of it's 4 patients at a time can go in, and you're sealed in, and it looks like a little mini submarine. The first time my son saw ours, the one that we used, he pointed to it, and he was like, look, that's a submarine, because it looks just like the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which we had just watched for family movie night. And so you go in, and the patients breathe in pure oxygen. So in my novel, at the beginning of the novel, someone deliberately, we think, sets fire by the oxygen tanks outside, starting an uncontrollable fire, which results in an explosion. There are deaths and injuries and some survivals. And we fast forward a year to the murder trial, where the mother of a boy who's been killed, who has autism, who's an 8-year-old boy, is accused of having sabotaged this chamber so that she could be rid of her son that she found burdensome. So the novel explores, the whodunit element, right? The whodunit, how done it, why done it. So it is a mystery in that sense, in the sense of, why would anybody do this? Did she really do it? Was it maybe the Korean immigrant family that was looking for, financial payoff from the insurance company? Was it maybe, other people who disapproved of this experimental therapy and the idea of trying to quote unquote fix kids? And so there are lots of issues that are, raised, and it is, a sort of twisty mystery from that perspective. But really, I wrote it so that it would hopefully provide a window into the lives of these people, these immigrants who are living in rural America, and the isolation that comes with that, and, the need for a community and how they find that, as well as the lives of this special needs community, and how the parents cope, and the competitiveness as well as the closeness that develops among the parents of these kids who have different degrees of illnesses and disabilities.
Well, that sounds like a perfect storm, just coming together. So,
exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that description. It's set in 2008, about 10 years ago.
Yes.
And I think you've just drawn upon the themes mostly of community, different sets of communities. Is there anything that you would change or add in if you were looking at it from this time?
Right.
Since there's been so much change in our society at large, nationally and globally.
Well, it's funny because I started writing it really, I started sort of doodling and things like that in 2012 and thinking about the characters, but really drafting it, I started in 2013 and really finished and got an agent actually on Election Day. I was in New York on Election Day, November 2016, and, interviewing various agents. And so that was when I sort of decided to go with my agent, and so it's an interesting time to have written it. But I specifically chose 2008 for a couple of reasons, and I think a lot of mystery writers will tell you this, is that, if you place things now, it's just with social media and with the ubiquity of cell phones and locators and GPS and things like that, it just makes it much more difficult for people to be sort of befuddled and, lost, and things that can help to sort of draw the mystery out and draw that suspense element out. So I would be able to do it, but I would definitely have to change things so that some of the suspense elements and characters wondering where, what's happening with so-and-so and blah, 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 like that would definitely change. And I do think that from a criminal investigation perspective, it would be much easier to try to track and try to recreate what happened, just from the fact that people just have their phones on them. And
the electronic path.
Yeah, exactly. So that I think that's really interesting just from a mystery perspective and writing mystery. So that's one thing to add a practical level. But the second thing is, and one of the characters talks about this, at the time this was written, or the time where it's set, when it's set, Obama was president. So, there was an African-American man who was the president of our country. And so some of the Korean characters who are, recent immigrants talk about this. And certainly that would be very different. And I just wonder, I'm not sure. I think I would have to do a lot more research into how it would feel to be an immigrant, and especially an Asian immigrant, without other Asians around
in rural
Virginia. Exactly. In a tiny town where, the residents go back generations, And so the characters definitely talk about that, and they talk about how they feel isolated. They don't belong. And I wonder if that would be even more overt now, or, so that would be really interesting to sort of go into one of these towns myself. I think I'd have to do a lot more research into that for sure. But those are some of the but I mean, certainly the rhetoric around immigration has changed, and the feelings about immigration, I think, have shifted, and certainly the way that we think about it and the way we talk about it has changed. Another big thing that's changed, I think, is that there's a sexual assault that happens in the novel, and it's the kind of thing that is just, the pre-Me Too era versus post-Me Too era, and the way that people think about it and the way that especially our legal system would deal with it, I think are completely different. And the way that I dealt with it in the novel when it's set 10 years ago versus the way I would deal with it if it's set like today, this year especially, is completely different, So that's interesting. So and that's something that a lot of readers have said, I'm really, really frustrated with the way that things got resolved on that issue. Like, that shouldn't have happened. And I have to remind them during book clubs and things, this happened 10 years ago. And then they immediately go, oh, yeah, you're right. Of course that happened, So anyway, that's another really interesting way in which things have really shifted.
Well, it's interesting that the timing, you seem to have precise timing in your course, in your journey of seemingly serendipitous things occurring. And then also you touched upon multiverse. So that's interesting that you are reflecting on, you were to set this novel a decade later. You probably have a subtle novel. And if you brought it it would just be very stark, and I don't know, just pop a whole different tone probably, and we'd all be like, wow, that's pretty harsh. That brings me to one last question. I'm wondering if you have anything percolating now in the works.
Yeah, I have a couple of things, and one is actually, I think, is really right on with sort of your topics and things like that. So when that's done, that's going to be probably my third novel. So when that's done, which will probably be 7 years from now or something, I'll have to remember to contact you, because I think that would be just, but I can't really talk about it because it's so in the incipient stages. But the next novel that I'm working on, that I'm starting to write right now, it's about a 10-year-old boy who's on the autism spectrum, who's nonverbal. And he goes on a walk at the beginning of the novel with his father, who's the primary caregiver, and only the boy returns home. And because he's nonverbal, he can't tell us what's happened. And his siblings, who are a little bit older, who are 17, 18, and who are fraternal twins, they become obsessed with using assistive communication technologies and therapies to try to sort of suss out this information and help him find his voice. So I think it should be interesting and touch on a lot of the issues of especially communication, which is something that I think about a lot as somebody who came to this country and went overnight from somebody who was very fluent and and I thought an effective sort of communicator, a huge talker, that type of thing, to somebody who felt like I didn't understand or couldn't say anything, in English when I came, and sort of experiencing that, even though it was sort of temporary for a year or two until I became fluent in English. It's the kind of thing that it's just so fundamental to who you are as a person, and you start realizing how fundamental communication is, not only to sort of communication, obviously, and connection with other people, but even to your sense of self-worth and self-competence, because communication and language is such a huge thing that people equate with intelligence, even if that's not necessarily so. And I think a lot of people in the autism world are starting to realize that right now, that these kids are intelligent, and we're treating them as if they have mental or cognitive disabilities, and it's not that at all. And then when you use some of these assistive communication therapies to try to draw them out using things like typing and things, and you start realizing there's a rich intelligence in there and so much pain because they're unable to communicate, and that's the thing. So and that's something that I felt, even though it's not even comparable, because like obviously it was transient. As an immigrant who doesn't speak the language, that this is gonna, is something that you're gonna overcome. But it's something that I felt, even though it was only for a brief period of time, and it affected me so much. And so I can't even imagine the pain of that, of going through that when you do have those issues. And so I really want to explore that and try to bring this to light for sure.
Well, I have one observation. So from your philosophical background or philosophy study, so two major things for personhood are autonomy and agency. And so I think you're getting towards that. And that's a very interesting shift in the way we view folks who are on the spectrum of autism and struggling with or trying to face a lot of challenges. Just that they're not totally defined by their condition, but they're people too. Just shifting gears a little bit, I think that Miracle Creek has been critically acclaimed, and I think you're reminding me of a new John Grisham, Scott Turow. Actually, I know Turow had a law background out of Chicago, and Grisham I'm not really certain of, but of course.
Yeah, no, they're both practicing attorneys.
Okay. We look forward to novels 2 and 3.
Yeah, absolutely.
and hearing more
so much
from you.
Okay, great.
Thank you for sharing your most interesting journey. And that's all the time we have for today. But I wanted to thank you, Angie, for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me. And this has been a really interesting discussion.
And thank you all for listening. My guest once again today has been Angie Kim, the author of Miracle Creek. I'm Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.